The airplane crashed in the middle of nowhere. There were no roads, no houses, and no people. There was only bush and rocks as far as the eyes could see. Only 2 children survived the crash. The airplane was on fire. The girl pulled her small brother away from it. "Run, Pete!" she shouted, "quick!" They ran through the bush as fast as they could. Then they started to climb up through some rocks. Near the top they stopped and looked down. From the rocks they watched the fire. "Where are we?" asked Peter. The girl didn't answer. She didn't know. They were lost in the Australian desert. But she couldn't tell Peter that. 2,500 kilometers away in the big city of Adelaide. Uncle Keith was at the airport. He looked at his watch. Keith's brother worked in America. He lived in Charleston, South Carolina, with his wife and 2 children. This was the children's first visit to Australia. But their airplane was late, it was very late. Uncle Keith waited and waited. He talked to other families. They asked about the plane, but nobody at the airport could tell them anything. Then people began to talk about an accident. About a plane crash. There were no survivors. Now it was dark and the children were alone. They were cold, so they climbed down between some rocks. They could see nothing, they could hear nothing. They were lost and they were afraid. "It's all right, Peter," said Mary. His sister's arms were round him. That felt better. When a boy is only 8, a big sister of 13 can be wonderful. They talked quietly, perhaps because there was no other noise, or perhaps because they were afraid. "Mary," Peter said, "I'm hungry. Have you got any chocolate?" Mary found the chocolate. She broke it in 2 and gave half to him. They sat very quietly in the black night. Then Peter started to move again. "My leg hurts," he said. Mary looked at it. "It's all right," she said. "It'll be better in the morning." Peter was quiet again. He fell asleep with Mary's arms round him. But Mary couldn't sleep. She watched her young brother. She was sister and mother to him now. She thought about the airplane journey and the accident. And she thought about her mother and her father. But her head felt heavy. Then she was asleep too. In the dark, the animals in the bush began to move. A wombat walked around the children. He pushed them with his nose, but he wasn't dangerous. He was interested in these strange new desert animals. But he didn't want to eat them. He only ate plants. Birds and insects started to fly around in the sky. A big marsupial tiger cat came near and looked at the children. She looked for a minute or 2. But these strange animals were very big. Her young babies couldn't eat them. So she walked quietly away. In the east, the sky was gray. It was the beginning of another day. Then the sun came up. It brought new colors to the bush, greens and whites and reds and yellows. Many people think that the desert is one boring color. They think there are no plants. But here in the Australian desert, there were beautiful plants in many different colors. The children slept through the wonderful early morning. A large gray bird, a kookaburra, sat in a tree above the children. He wanted food, a small animal or some insects. But on the rocks below him, he could see only two very large animals. They were different from the other desert animals. He wanted to tell every animal and bird in the desert about them. He opened his mouth and made a loud noise. It wasn't a song because the kookaburra doesn't sing. The girl opened her eyes and looked up. She was afraid, but then she saw the bird. So it was only a bird. She laughed and looked at Peter. Good. He was asleep. He couldn't hear the bird. Peter looked small and thin and very, very young. She loved him very much. When he wakes up, he'll be hungry. What can I give him? She thought. There was more chocolate, but there wasn't very much, and that was all. She got up and looked round. Down below her, she could see a small river, so water wasn't a problem. But how could they find food? What could they eat? People died without food. She looked at the kookaburra. He made another loud noise. Not me, he said. Then he flew away, up into the sky. There were other birds, big white cockatoos in the trees, and smaller birds near the river, on the rocks and in the water. They played happily. Mary felt hot and her dress was dirty. She wanted to go down there and swim with them. She looked round her. Peter was asleep. There were no other people there in the bush with them. Nobody could see her. She undressed and went down to the river. The green water was wonderful and clean. She laughed and played. She swam under the water so the birds could see only her long hair. She was happy again. It was now warm and sunny and light. Her brother heard the sound of water and opened his eyes. Where am I? For a minute, he was lost. He wasn't in his bedroom. He wasn't in an airplane. Then he saw Mary in the river. Hi, Mary. He shouted. I'm coming too. He climbed down to the river quickly. He threw off his clothes and jumped off a rock into the middle of the river. Peter, what are you doing? You can't swim. She swam to him and pulled him to the rocks. There, she helped him out of the water. I can swim. She said, okay, she said, but not in the middle. Stay near the rocks. He jumped into the river again, but this time he stayed near the rocks. Mary watched him for a minute. Then she remembered. She had no clothes on. She got out of the river onto the rocks and put her dress on quickly. Peter looked up at her. Your dress is wet, he said. Why didn't you get dry first? Come out now, Peter, and put your clothes on. Mary pulled him out of the water and dried him with his shirt. Then she helped him dress. He was happy after his swim. I'm hungry, he said. What can we eat? Here's some chocolate. Mary gave the chocolate to him. Peter looked at it. It's very small, is that all? Yes, that's all, said Mary sadly. Peter ate the chocolate quickly and then he ran away from her. He started to play in the rocks. He doesn't understand the problems. That's good, thought Mary. But there were a lot of questions in her head. What can we do next? Where can we go? How can we find Uncle Keith? She had no answers. Mary, Mary!" Peter shouted. "Come quickly." She climbed over the rocks to him. His hands were inside his jeans. "Something's hurting me," he cried. Mary pulled down Peter's jeans and looked at his legs. There were a lot of insects all over them, and there were more insects on the ground. His legs were very red. "It's all right," she said. "They're only ants. My legs really hurt," he cried. She pushed him away from the insects. "Okay, Peter, now sit down." She pulled off his trousers and hit the ants on his legs. "Ow!" he cried loudly. But the insects went away quickly. "There aren't any ants now, Pete, it's all right." Peter looked at his legs. They were very red and they hurt. He started to cry. Mary put her arms around him and he felt better. He stopped crying for a minute, but then he started again. "What is it, Pete?" "I don't like this place, Mary. I want to go home." "We can't go home, Pete. Home is in America. How can we get across the sea?" "Then let's go to Uncle Keith's in Adelaide." Mary looked at him. "So you remember," she said. "All right, I'll take you to Uncle Keith." He stopped crying. "When, now, yes," she said, "now, we'll walk to Adelaide now." Mary was only 13, but she was clever. Adelaide was in the south of Australia. It was early morning and the sun was on her left. The sun was in the east in the morning. So south was in front of them. The small river in front of them also went south. "Let's go, Peter," she said to her brother. They started to walk down the river. For the first half an hour, it was easy and Peter walked fast. Then it got harder. There were big plants in front of them. They climbed over them or they walked around them. After 2 hours, Pete was tired. Walking was difficult. He didn't say anything, but Mary knew. "Let's sit down here," she said. He sat near her and put his head in his hands. They said nothing. They watched the river. "I'm hungry, Mary. What are we going to eat?" "Oh, Peter, it's not lunchtime." "When will it be lunchtime?" "I'll tell you." But there were more questions. "What are we going to eat for lunch?" "We'll find something." But what could they find? There were a lot of plants. But they didn't have any food on them. Quickly, Mary got up. "All right, let's find some food." Peter jumped up. "Great idea," he said. They looked in the river, but they couldn't find any fish. The fish were asleep at the bottom of the river. They looked in the trees for birds. But birds in the Australian desert sleep in the day. They looked in the bush for animals, but the animals were asleep in the rocks. They didn't find any food. "I don't like this game," said Peter. "I want to go home." They walked and walked. They were hungry and tired. Then the bush was more open and they could see better. There was high ground in front of them. "Mary, yes, Pete. Look up there. Let's climb to the top. Perhaps we'll see the sea." "That's a good idea." They started to climb. They climbed for 4.5 hours and then they arrived at the top. The desert to the south in front of them was beautiful. The light of the evening sun was wonderful, and there far away they could see water. It shone in the evening sun. The boy danced happily. Look, Mary. Look, the sea, the sea. It isn't far. Look. Don't look, Pete, she said quietly. She put her arms around the little boy. I'm very, very sorry. It wasn't water. Mary knew that. It was the great Australian desert. Hundreds of kilometers of it. We can't walk to the sea today, Pete. Let's find a place for the night, said Mary. She got up and pulled Peter to his feet. We'll walk to the sea tomorrow. Tomorrow we won't be hungry. The next morning Mary woke up first. She looked up at the birds in the sky. Then Peter woke up too. Mary, let's go. Let's walk to the sea. First we have to look for food, said Mary. We have to take some food with us on our journey. Good idea, said Peter. I'm very hungry. They looked and looked for food. For a long time they found nothing. Then Peter shouted. Look, Mary, fruit. There was a tree with round balls of fruit on it. Some of the balls were green and some were red. Mary thought carefully for a minute. You could get ill from some fruits, but they had to eat. She ran to the tree. She ate a green fruit and it was good. Then she ate a red fruit. It was better. Try these, Peter. They're nicer. The children ate and ate. That's good, said Peter. I'm not thirsty now. We don't have to carry water. We can take some of these with us. Mary pulled her skirt up in front of her. She took some fruit and put it there. Peter began to find more fruit too. He went from tree to tree. Mary, somebody's here, he called back to her. Don't be stupid, Peter. I'm not stupid. Somebody's watching us. Mary turned round. Her mouth fell open and she put her hand up to her face. There was a boy very near them, only a meter away. He was black and he was naked. Mary started to run away, but then she looked again. The boy was young and friendly. He smiled, so perhaps he wasn't dangerous. At home in South Carolina there were black Africans. But this boy was browner and his hair was different. He had big blue-black eyes and he had a baby wallaby in one hand. Peter and Mary looked at the boy for a long time. And he looked at them. Nobody spoke and nobody moved. They waited and waited. They were from different worlds. Peter and Mary came from a big city. Their people looked after them. The bush boy lived in the desert. It was his home and he understood it. The bush boy put the wallaby on the ground. It was dead. He smiled. Wuramgala, where do you come from? Mary looked at Peter and Peter looked at Mary. They didn't understand. The bush boy tried again. Wuramwa, where are you going? We don't understand you, boy, said Peter. But we're lost. Show us the way to Adelaide. Uncle Keith lives there. Which way do we go? The black boy smiled again and Peter smiled back. The boy went to Peter and felt his face. Then he put his hand on Peter's hair. Then he felt his clothes, the shirt and the jeans. Those are trousers, boy. Why haven't you got any? You're naked. It's not right, aren't there any shops here? But the bush boy was too busy. He didn't listen. He looked at Peter's shoes. Then he turned to Mary. Mary wasn't very happy. At home in Charleston, South Carolina, no black person came near white people. But a lot of people in Charleston had strange ideas, and this boy didn't look dangerous. So it was okay. She didn't move. The bush boy felt her face and her arms too. And he felt her clothes. Then he looked at her carefully for a long time. Mary waited. He'll finish and then he'll go away, she thought. Peter waited too. First, he waited quietly and watched the bush boy. Then he began to kick the ground with his feet. Suddenly his face changed color. It went very red. He put his hand to his nose. He shut his mouth and he made a strange noise. Mary turned round. "Peter, what are you doing?" asked Mary. Peter put his face in his hands. But nothing could stop him now. Suddenly there was a loud noise. Peter sneezed and then he sneezed again very, very loudly. "Stop it, Peter," said Mary. She was angry because she wasn't in charge now. Behind her there was a different noise. The bush boy laughed. He laughed because Peter's sneeze was a very big sneeze from a very small boy. Then Peter laughed too. The two boys fell to the ground. They kicked their legs and moved their arms. They couldn't stop. They laughed and laughed. Mary watched them. She wanted to laugh too, but she was too old for that. So she went to Peter. "Stop that now, Peter." Peter sat up and looked at her. The bush boy looked at her too. Slowly he got up and walked back to his wallaby. He took it and walked quietly away. He went down the hill. Then he went behind some trees and they couldn't see him. "Mary," Peter cried. "What did you do?" "Look, he's going." Mary was quiet. She was afraid of the bush boy because he was naked. And she didn't want help from him. It was wrong. At home in South Carolina, you didn't ask a black boy for help. But he was the only person there and perhaps he could help them. Peter was younger and life was easier for him. He liked the bush boy and they had to have help. He jumped up and down. "Mary, let's go after him. Let's find him." He ran quickly through the bush. "Peter, wait," Mary called after him. But Peter didn't stop. "Hey, boy," he shouted. "We're coming too. Wait for us, wait for us." The bush boy turned and waited. "Hey, don't leave us," said Peter. "We want food and drink in Adelaide." "Where's Adelaide?" The black boy didn't understand but he laughed. Peter tried again. "Look, boy, we're lost. We want water. Do you understand water? Water, water, water." He made a cup with his hands and took them up to his mouth. The bush boy understood now. He didn't laugh this time. In the bush people were often thirsty. He made a cup with his hands too. "Arkelula," he said. "That's it, boy, you understand. Arkelula, we want arkelula and food too." He put his hand to his face and moved his mouth. "Yamara," said the bush boy. "Yes, that's right. We want Yamara and Arkelula. But where can we find them?" The black boy turned and walked into the bush. Then he stopped and looked back. "Kurura," he said. "Let's go," the boy called out to Mary. "Kurura," that means, "follow me." And he ran after the bush boy. The bush boy walked for about an hour, and the children followed. Then they came to some very tall trees. After the strong sun in the open bush, it was quite dark. Mary and Peter couldn't see very well, and they fell again and again. But it was quiet and nothing moved. And it wasn't as hot as the desert. The bush boy walked quickly. Hour after hour, the bush boy walked, and Mary and Peter followed. The bush boy never got tired, but Peter did. "Wait for me, Mary. You're walking too fast." Mary stopped. "All right, Pete," she said to her little brother. "It'll be all right. We'll wait for you. My legs hurt." "Here, Pete, take my hand." She was happy because now she was his big sister again. Peter pulled on her hand. "I'm thirsty. I'm hungry." "Me too, Pete." Her mouth was hot and dry, but we can't stop now. Suddenly the trees ended. And there was the desert again. Kilometers and kilometers of desert. With its hot sun and no water. "Kurura," said the bush boy. He left the trees and started to walk in the desert. But Mary stopped. "Where's the food? Where's the water? It's too far for us. We'll never find it." She sat down under the last tree before the desert. And Peter sat down next to her. The bush boy came back. He spoke quietly in his strange language. But they understood. "You have to follow me or you'll die. There's water. It's not far now. Look over there." With his hand, he showed them some rocks and a small hill. "But that's a long way," said Mary. The desert was hot, but here under the trees, it was nice. It was easier to stay here. And was the bush boy right? Was there really water in those rocks? In the middle of the desert? "Arkelula," the bush boy said again and again. Mary looked harder. It was dark round the bottom of the hill. Why? Were there bushes, green trees and bushes? "There is water there, Pete. Trees are only as green as that when there's water." She jumped up and the three children walked out, into the desert. The sun went down before they arrived at the hill. But there was a little light. And they could see the green bushes. They walked through them. "Arkelula," said the bush boy and smiled. Mary and Peter were excited. They could hear water. It was very near. Peter wasn't tired now and he ran in front of them. "It's water, Mary." "Water," he shouted. "Arkelula," said the bush boy again. Peter was on the ground with his head in beautiful, clean water. Mary sat down on the ground next to him. And the two white children drank. They drank and drank. The water was good, but it was warm. The bush boy sat next to Mary. With his hands, he took water from the bottom of the river. Mary did the same. Now the water was colder and better. The bush boy drank only a little. Then he stood up. He climbed up the hill and sat on a rock. He was interested in the children. He watched them carefully. They were strange. They didn't know the desert. They didn't know anything. Where were they from? Why were they here? They couldn't live alone in the desert. I have to help them, he thought. The small boy stopped drinking and climbed up to the bush boy. The rocks were big and it was difficult for him. The bush boy put out his hand and helped him up. Peter sat down and looked at the wallaby. He felt it with his hands. Eat, he asked. Yumara. The bush boy smiled and got up. He climbed down from the rocks. He looked at different rocks and stopped. In front of a big flat piece. Then he found some wood. Peter watched, but he didn't understand. Lorana, said the bush boy. He began to build a fire. I know. Peter was excited. Fire, you're going to make a fire. Lorana, said the bush boy again. Okay, Lorana, you're going to make a Lorana. I'll help. The bush boy found more wood and Peter helped him, but Peter stopped suddenly. How can we light a fire? He asked. When we haven't got any. Peter didn't finish his question, but watched the bush boy with his mouth open. Australian trees have very dry wood and Aboriginals can make fire in the old way. The bush boy sat by the flat rock. He put some very small pieces of wood on the rock. Then he took a long piece of wood between his hands. He put the end of this into the small pieces and moved it round and round very fast. And very quickly, there was a good fire. That's clever, said Peter. He put some more wood on the fire. Mary sat alone and watched the boys. Peter followed the bush boy everywhere. He didn't want her now. Boys didn't want to be with girls. Why can't I be a boy too, she thought. She watched the smoke from the fire, sadly. The boy took the wallaby and cooked it slowly on the fire. An hour later, they sat down near the fire and ate it. A dingo sat on a rock only 10 meters away and watched them. There was a lot of meat and they ate it all. There wasn't any meat for the dingo. Now they were tired. The bush boy put some water on the fire. Then the 3 children slept. Mary woke up first before the sun was up. She watched the sky. What was up there? Another life. Life after death. Heaven. She didn't know. She looked at the naked bush boy and then looked away quickly. Why am I not a boy too? She thought. Life is easy for boys. She thought about life in the bush with the black boy. He knew the desert and he could survive. That was good. Then Peter woke up. He sat up and looked at Mary and then at the bush boy. How can we get to Adelaide, Mary? Will the boy take us? At home in South Carolina. She usually knew the answers to Peter's questions. But here in the bush, she didn't. I don't know, she said. Perhaps he doesn't know Adelaide. And how can we ask him? We don't speak his language. There were other questions about the boy in Mary's head too. Why was he alone in the desert? Where was his family? What was best for her and Peter? She didn't have any answers. "Let's wait and see," she said to Peter. "I'm not in charge now," she thought. And then she felt better. She closed her eyes and fell asleep again. She woke up after about 2 hours. Half asleep, she could hear the boys. "What are you laughing at, Peter?" she called. But Peter couldn't hear her, so he didn't answer. He shouted and played with the bush boy in the water. Mary sat up and saw the two boys. Peter looked back. "Mary," he shouted. "Come here and play with us." "Later," she shouted back. When it's warmer, Peter ran after the bush boy. They ran round some rocks. Then the bush boy stopped suddenly. "Warwara," he said, excited. On the ground there was a brown ball. It was the top of a plant. Peter felt the brown ball with his hand. "Yamara?" he asked. The bush boy smiled. Yes, it was food. He pulled the strange plant out of the ground. The bottom of the plant under the ground was green, and there was also a pretty flower.